Hi, and welcome back to our reading of The Red Lion by Maria Schepers. Today we are continuing with our chapter number 23, The Black Eros. And we are continuing on with our main character, Louis de la Tourzel, in this incarnation, with his adventure with the woman in this life, Karina. And we ended last reading halfway into chapter 23, it's a long one, with their wedding where she ends it with let us go home to your place. And I mean, this chapter is just, to me, it's like the complete exposure of everything that we have learned through our human consciousness to desire, to try to achieve everything that we have learned is the goal of our lives. These outer achievements that turn out to be empty, or even worse, completely detrimental to us. And I think the language she uses and that the translators have managed to come up with here is just a complete exposure of everything we're dealing with in our own minds and feeling world. And maybe unlike our protagonist, we're able to learn something from following his failures, which eventually he'll get over it. But two of my friends today were talking about this old song, Circle of Hands, and the lyrics to it. And I wanted to, in light of the evil that we are faced with, both from our own inner confederacy and the forces out there, which our hero in the book is constantly seeing. He sees all these astral forces pulling and pushing and trying to torment him. And yet he gets used to it. Anyway, I thought this is being reminded of it. I thought this song is a good commentary. So instead of a lullaby in Norwegian, we'll do a song in English. Circle of Hands. Circle of hands, cold spirits plan, searching my land for an enemy. Came across love's sweet cause, and in the face of beauty, evil was lost. The future has its price, and today is only yesterday's tomorrow. Tomorrow, tomorrow, tomorrow. Today is only yesterday's tomorrow. And we'll see where that leads us. So, we ended last reading with an episode from their wedding, and they went into the salon, and he kissed her, and then she says, "Come on, let's go home to you." Continuing on. It was Karina's erotic genius that made me her enthralled slave. Her instinct never faltered. I have seldom met a lover who didn't admit that his longed-for first night had been an embarrassing disappointment. But with Karina, I had no such problem. Her ingenuity stretched the seconds to hours. She was the dark priestess of lust, the lewd astral religion. The next day, she immersed herself in the Asses' pornography and read the erotic sexual lore like someone at last admitted to a longed-for paradise. Since it was I who broke the seal on this dangerous bottle and let out the demon that took possession of her, I atoned most severely and suffered most from the astral density of the demonic passion. She sharpened her weapons on me. I was the guinea pig of her orgiastic exercises. She was the teacher and I the pupil of this intense, unrestrained magic. Karina's undeveloped nubile charm soon gave way to the feverish sensuality of a perpetually hungry, unrestrained woman. Every curve, every movement was a lewd promise. She cared for her body as the truly great Hetore once had, bewildering the servants by bathing twice a day. Both body and hair were soaked with perfumes, and her clear, blooming skin was always powdered. She wore her own light, fragrant hair, using wigs only when we went out to the theater or some ball. And later, when she began sneaking out for secret adventures. Karina had a passion for masks. She had a whole collection of them, and she used them at every opportunity. One of her favorite tricks was to slip into my room at night, attired only in a lacy silk mask and her splendid nakedness. Pretending to be seeking refuge, she would hold a candle over her head and greet me in a disguised voice. "For God's sake, monsieur, forgive my intrusion. I had no choice. Hide me, I beg you. Please hide me. They are coming for me." I always went along with the game. "But who are you, madame, and how did you find your way to my room dressed only in a mask?" "Don't ask. There isn't time. I hear them coming. Where can I hide?" "Well, you can get in my bed if you like." "Anywhere." Then she would jump in beside me. She would act like she was trying to avoid me, but the arch of her back and hips always offered themselves to me. Thus, she became mine every night, always in a different guise. Karina's hungry young body never tired of making love, but I, who was set aflame over and over, began to be drained of my Messalina. I started losing weight, got pains in my back, broke out in sweats, and got dizzy when I walked. My condition would have become really serious if Pelok hadn't intervened. When he first suggested a trip to restore my health, I wouldn't hear of being separated from Karina. She herself snuggled against me like a frightened little girl after Pelok had told her about the matter and asked me if it was true that she was making me ill with her love. What could I tell her? I told her she was my life, health, and happiness, and this quickly calmed her. Then she claimed her pleasure yet again. It wasn't until I had fainted after an orgasm that she began to encourage me to go to the seashore. She joined forces with Pelok, and both besieged me with arguments. "If you love Karina and want to live with her for years to come, you have got to be cured of that incipient lung disease. You owe it to her." Karina joined in vehemently. If I should die, she couldn't live another minute. "It's terrible to be separated for a few months," she told me. "But it's better than being separated for forever." I was troubled suddenly, for I realized she was lying to me. But At the time, I simply thought Pelok had scared her. Her turbulent emanations were scored with waves of sensuality, and I flattered myself they were directed at me. So I listened as she talked about her mother's bitter fate and begged me not to condemn her to the same thing. I was moved, fascinated, and convinced. I didn't know then that the person I really should have thanked for saving my life was a handsome, muscular, curly-haired stable boy whom Karina hired just after I left. He brought her the cynical, coarse sensuality of the Paris underworld. She should have seen that this inane, befuddled youth was a future blackmailer, but Karina's perceptions of people were apparently different from mine. To her, Marcel was a new variation of pleasure, and he was sufficiently robust to endure her tireless passion. Karina never felt any remorse or repentance. She simply took up with anyone her appetite desired as instinctively and naturally as a young animal. When I began to demand explanations, she lied exasperately as though she were placating a child who made impossible demands. At first, she was amazed that I should be so angry. What was the matter with me? Had I really imagined she would be content with just one man? She loved me, and I was an important support to her, but I had not been able to satisfy her. Her beautiful body and erotic art demanded infinite variety. This was her nourishment and life breath. I could possess and enjoy her, but I could never own her. I realized then that she embodied all the lustful demons of the astral world. She was a machine of gratification that understood no moral cordon. Instinct reigned supreme in her. So, Karina lied without flinching, repeated banal promises, assured me of her fidelity, and demanded my trust, even in the most scandalous situation. She was slippery as an eel, elusive and unwavering in her purpose. We had been married just a year when I left Karina alone for the first time to go to Corsica, miserable in body and in mind. I rented a primitive cottage close to the rocky seashore in Porto Vecchio area where the fiery sun could burn the disease from my body. If I hadn't been impaled by my passion, I could have been blissfully happy in my new retreat. I slept on the open porch to get that foul air of the city completely out of my lungs. That had been Homunculus's method, I remembered. I loved to watch the interplay of sky and sea, these masterpieces of whimsical and powerful artists who forever brought new variations to their work. There was the pearl-gray curtain of dawn. Then the royal disk of the sun glided forth with a different entourage of color each day. It would change in front of my eyes from a blood-red lamp to a white fireball that heated the air like a furnace. And the sea, that wide feminine eye, mirrored the heavenly mystery. It always grew cooler at sunset, and the clouds dropped their borrowed tiara of gold, red, and violet. A cool wind would blow from the sea, which became sullen and restless and gave off its salty odors. Now the animals would come out after their sleep during the heat of the day. The stars would come out in the bluestone sky, and Clara, the gentle peasant woman who looked after me, would begin to sing in the kitchen. She always sang an ancient, sweet love song of the type only found in the Mediterranean. Then the treacherous fever would rack my body as I began to remember Karina. The memory of holding that painfully desired body drained me like a succubus. It was no good being away from her. She was still with me. I wrote long letters of longing, and she answered with brief scribbles like an obedient schoolgirl. I got a special messenger to take our messages back and forth. I spared no expense. Even then, I was nearly crazy at the time he took. In addition, I told the messenger, a self-important stupid fellow named Vernier, to observe everything. Did Madame look well? What did she talk about? Did she send any verbal messages? What was she wearing? And did the servants say she was sad when she was alone? The poor stupid fellow wanted to give me my money's worth, so he would always tell me that Karina was in the best of health, that she went out a good deal in the afternoon and evening, always accompanied by Jean Girard, that she dressed gorgeously, was never sad, and giggled a great deal with her pert maid Josette. No matter how late she had been up, she always got up early and rode with Marcel, the new stable boy. The only verbal messages were that I was to take care of myself, not to rush the cure, and come back to her completely healed. In spite of my agonies of love, the fresh air and sunshine were gradually restoring my sick lungs and blood. Sea baths and long swims improved my appetite and revived my spirits, and Clara's full, simple meals began to fill out my bony frame. Long walks in the sun and wind bronzed my skin, and I began to swim farther and farther out to sea. The restoration of my health cheered me, and the passionate love I still bore for Karina after 4 months' absence was not so stressing as before. A rested, well-fed man who has peaceful dreams gets rid of his jealous fantasies easier than one who is physically depleted. For a long time, I didn't want to be aware of my gnawing jealousy. When it finally reached the threshold of awareness as a painful doubt, I shoved it from me hurriedly. My astral tortures drew back and watched me, waiting for the inevitable to happen, just as they had done in Straubing when my vanity had made me the captive of Anton Bruggendorf. My inner conflict kept me from going home as soon as I could have. I hesitated, torn between the desire to embrace Karina with renewed strength and fear of learning something I didn't want to know. Finally, cowardice won out. I decided to minimize my risk by sending Vernier ahead to tell Karina I was coming. The ruse didn't work. I managed to get home before Vernier, and my arrival was completely unexpected. Vernier had been assaulted and robbed on the way to Toulon and was unconscious in a hospital, unable to tell anyone anything. It was futile of me to try to avert what fate intended. I would have found out the truth even if Vernier had gotten there before me. It wasn't even disguised. Not the affair with Marcel, no, though I learned all about that. Marcel was snarling against Karina like a rabid dog, sending her threatening letters that she threw into the fire with a laugh. Naturally, he came to me when I returned. It wasn't just desire for money that led this blackmailer to tell me every detail of their perverted, sordid affair. It was a jealous revenge that drove him. No male ever got away from Karina without a mortal wound. I had the cynical satisfaction of seeing what had become of the beautiful Marcel with his bulging muscles and sweet perfumes. Now, he had the baggy eyes and trembling hands caused by many nights of hard drinking. He had turned to alcohol, the narcotic of primitive man, to burn the memory of Karina's naked fragrance from his body and brain. She had just played with him for a few weeks, but now his clothing hung on a stooped frame and he obviously didn't bother to wash. Naturally, I ordered him out and had him thrown out when he became insistent. I found out later that he was finally executed for murder. I often wondered why the crude, vindictive Spade had not murdered Karina, who had led him to his downfall. He had watched her careless, unguarded moves for months and even followed her on her masked nightly escapades. But he had never dared to talk to her. Once, he had staggered up in front of her among the trees of the Bois de Boulogne, but Karina just laughed and looked straight at him, as she asked him what he wanted, and he couldn't even manage to utter a word. He slunk away like a hypnotized wild beast. It was not Marcel I found in Karina's bed the warm October night I returned from Corsica. It was a sixth-rate actor named Alfred Lecoeur, an hysterical pink monkey who nearly fainted when he saw me. He ran distractedly around the room, holding his red silk trousers in front of him, unable to locate the door. But I was more confused than he. I stood speechless, barely conscious of what I witnessed. It was Karina who remained cool. She sharply told her whimpering lover that the exit was on the right and to get the hell out of there before I killed him. Then she got up without even bothering to conceal her nakedness and approached me with quiet defiance. You think I've betrayed you, don't you? You've thought that all along. That's why you sneaked home unannounced at night, just so you could get some proof to support your suspicion. You should have stayed here with me like a proper husband, to protect me from temptation and embrace me when I hungered for it. You went off and left me to sleep alone with my fierce desires. Oh, don't make excuses. You could have been back long ago, she said accusingly to me. Then her tone changed. You're strong and healthy, and you stayed away for months while I longed for you. She pressed closer to me. I was hungry. I relived every moment I spent in your arms, and still you didn't come. Men kept following me and whispering suggestions. I couldn't bear it any longer. As for that eunuch, I just wanted to tantalize him with my nakedness without actually giving him anything. I read to him from those books until he lay whining beside me. That torture alone pleased me enough so that I didn't commit the sin of infidelity. I slapped her. I didn't realize it until I felt my hand swing and jerk like a whip. Then I jerked open the door in disgust and despair, determined to run away from this foul, disgraced bedroom and the astral demons who mocked me. But Karina thwarted me with those naked arms that twined about me like lianas. I cursed her and beat at her, trying to free myself from those arms and thighs, but she clung to me with surprising strength. I love you, she gasped. I love the hand that beats me. You, how strong you've gotten. Your skin is brown and smooth now. I never wanted you so much, and I won't let you go. Come to me, you were my first and only. I glanced down into the hopeless inferno that was her soul. I knew she was lying, and I knew what would become of me if I stayed with her. But that violent passion overpowered both outrage and self-respect. She set me aflame again. We fell onto the bed, and I let the red vortex carry me away. I should have put Karina away, banished her. Nobody who has ever been overpowered against his better judgment will ever understand why I did not do just that. Part of me longed to be free, but the other part was a slave. My violent, trembling passion made me a prisoner on the astral plane, bound by Karina's bewitching loins. In the same manner, Francesco Giuseppe Borri had been imprisoned on the deepest plane of matter by the alliance with Homunculus. I can't even say that I believed Karina when we acted out our farce of a reconciliation with tears and promises. No, I knew and understood what was happening in and around her, and I despised her. But though I could not leave her, I could not keep myself from striking her, time and again in my futile anger. I beat her and dragged her around by the hair. I, who had never before imagined I could hit a woman. But the more I beat her, the more humbly she crept back to me, and the more she conquered me with her body. Nothing made her happier than to force a man to succumb to her against his will and take her in a blind passion of lust. It was the dark side of Eros that took possession of her now. She no longer sought the straightforward pleasure of strong young bodies. What attracted her was the depraved and bizarre, the rotten and perverse, the tragic and the dangerous. I saw what was happening to her and knew I could not save her. I lived in a state of constant worry about both of us. Our fights and reconciliations were becoming more frequent all the time. I would leave her and find I had to hurry back. I would rush into brothels to barricade the memory of her body with other women, only to find that in the instant of climax I called her name. Her fragrance, nuances, the delicate shaping of every part of her body, the stir of her movements and the bright whip of her laughter had invaded my very being. It was only her body that made my senses glow and racked me with lust. The more often and more deeply I fell, the more indestructible was her demon's power over me, despite what I knew about her. Not only did it control my physical reality, but my astral world as well, where my passion made it even more powerful. The composite being created by my astral passion did not even have Karina's lying beauty. It was an obese reptile with bulging eyes, covered with a slime of self-centered lust. Only the perversion of sexual excitement could make it desirable even for a few minutes. Yet, the monster grew continuously from our sinful gushing of sperm and tainted blood from which no life could be born, for Karina's womb was barren. People don't really understand the mystery of blood and sperm. They think that when this awesome oil of the lamp of carnal pleasure is expended on a barren, goading passion, it overflows the circle of the obsessed lovers without consequence. Actually, a dark life springs from each dark ecstasy. The diseased and debauched loins produce succubi and incubi, those elemental astral vampires who visit the lonely beds of troubled adolescents, frightened virgins, longing widows and perverts, and drain their strength in the hours of sleep and loneliness. The priests of the Black Masses knew this. It is said that one of them performed the infamous sperm mass for Diane de Poitiers, conjuring a hideous demon who was bound to obey his parent and conjurer. This is supposed to account for the young Henry II's obsessive love of a woman old enough to be his mother. Karina's maid, Josette, married, and Karina hired a haggard, domineering woman as a replacement. She had met this woman, Germaine Renier, at a secret gambling house she had taken to frequenting without my knowledge. Germaine Renier was no chambermaid. Rather, she was her mistress's friend and confidant. She had a supercilious manner and was always talking about her aristocratic and pontifical connections, and intimated she knew things that could unhinge even the royal palace. She herself, she hinted, came from high origins she kept sacred for very good reasons. Actually, she was an intrepid, talented confidence woman, and she used her talent to organize Karina's disordered depravity. In addition, her masculine manner and incongruous clothing revealed her true inclination. She reminded me of Christina of Sweden. This woman now became both slave and ruler of Karina's bedroom, from which I was artfully excluded. I raged at Karina and threatened her. I revealed Germaine's true sexual proclivities and demanded that she dismiss her. She cried and smiled that childlike smile at me and told me I was accusing her of things she didn't even understand. "Germaine is a high-born woman fallen on hard times," she would say, "and she has come to me for help. I would rather join her in her poverty and that remove her from her station. You've got such a dirty mind, you see evil everywhere," she complained once. "You've made my life hell. Already your jealousy has broken my spirit, and now I'm even scared to sleep with you when I used to want to so much. But the real reason I've not let you into the bedroom is that Recently I dreamed that my father came and urged me to become a nun. He made me promise to be chaste for 2 months and go to church." Truly, Karina was an able pupil of Jean Girard. She had even learned to dream what suited her. I was suddenly consumed by such violent anger. I was afraid I would crush her skull. The intensity of the feeling terrified me. I ran. When I came back, the bedroom door was locked again, and Karina begged me to leave her alone because she had a headache. I knew Germain was in bed with her. I kicked the door and left. Péloc, to whom I revealed my total misery, did his best to help. He gave me excellent advice on how to break my emotional slavery. He told me I could turn my convulsive emotions to calm indifference if I continuously used conscious autosuggestion. I should concentrate on everything that was hateful about Karina and on the repulsive bodily functions she shared with all humankind. He suggested that I remember the Hindu teaching that woman is only a vessel filled with urine and feces. I tried to do this, but I couldn't. Things that were repulsive in any other circumstances were exciting in connection with Karina, or else I simply could not associate the ugly thing with her. Meanwhile, Germain brought her insatiable mistress every imaginable pleasure, and Karina's astral surroundings became increasingly horrible. Every debauchery brought a new demon to join the legion of depravity. Already, she had begun to attend the Black Mass. She was just 21 and had been my wife for 5 horrible years. At last, Jeanne managed to get Corte to marry her, and I met Le Pitre and Rosalie again at the wedding. Le Pitre was more haggard and feverish than ever, and Rosalie was even more exalted and slovenly. During the ceremony, I noticed that Karina's perverse imagination was being fascinated by the tuberculous prophet. He was a veritable bonfire of unsatiated sensuality, and he positively radiated the murderous hunger of asceticism. Karina and her invisible demons were naturally struck by this unsuspecting bundle of energy who was suppressed by self-reproach and embalmed in penances. And then there was the amusement of robbing the love-struck old Rosalie of her one and only God. Here indeed was a tasty assortment of masochistic and sadistic lust, danger, and tragedy to enjoy. I knew Le Pitre didn't stand a chance. He couldn't escape Karina's sexual magic. If he had really been pure and saintly, of course, the temptation would have bounced off him like a child's arrow off a stone wall. But his astral surrounding was infected, and his unresolved relationship with Rosalie kept his senses and sentimentality in constant turmoil. Jean Girard's preposterous tragicomic wedding reminded me of my own marriage when Karina was wreathed in orange blossoms and surrounded with a halo of veils. What a trap it had been! To what extremes she had carried me, this diabolical virgin through whose embrace I had hoped to find heaven. Jeanne's flat, powdered face looked coarse in her exaltation, and her towering white wig merely accented her essential vulgarity. The jewels her quote-unquote dreams had brought her looked like cheap stage jewelry on her puffy breast and fleshy fingers. Her loud manner, with its mixture of servility and arrogant familiarity, was already changing to the condescending reservation of the socially established woman. Now at last, after years of elbowing and lying, she had reached her goal of respectability, and she looked dazed and a trifle tired, like someone reaching fulfillment of any goal. It is always a moment mixed with disappointment and resignation. Corte, the husband, glowed with the simple happiness of the idiotic child. He was happy, and Jeanne was happy, but what different things the word meant to each of them. I had never been so aware of the limitation of words. They conceal reality rather than reflect it. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law, the Marquise d'Anjou, had become more preoccupied and absent-minded. The gap between reality and her private world had widened, and she looked over at the people on the other side with an uncertain smile, hardly aware of their presence. She had besieged God in prayer, and he gave her beautiful dreams, caressing this faithful and gentle child who had waded so unsuspectingly through the dangerous tideland of Jeanne's visions and the perilous swamps of the lamb's beliefs. Now she met her husband every night, thus being compensated for the loss of Jeanne. She lived her days in a dream and knew reality only at night in her husband's arms. This introverted creature had not the slightest doubt about Karina's fidelity or the happiness of our marriage, and I wouldn't have jarred her world with the truth even if I could have. Karina wore a pale green brocade dress to the wedding. It had a deep, rectangular neckline and a small waist that exposed the twin mounds of her pointed breasts. She was wearing a heavy, sweet oriental perfume she had bought for a pretty penny from an old Turkish eunuch in some mysterious exile in Paris. This perfume always disturbed me, filling me with bitter anger and a piercing desire. And of course, she was spreading it all around her with a movement of her black Venetian lace fan. After the ceremony, I happened into the small reading room that opened off the yellow salon. There, I found Karina standing in the window recess with Le Pitre. My footsteps made no sound on the soft carpet, and they were unaware of my presence, indeed seeming to be in a trance. Karina's face and posture and the glowing red vortex around them immediately told me what was going on. Le Pitre, his eyes half closed and feverish spots burning in his cheeks, talked in a subdued, passionate tone, and Karina was listening. I knew well enough how she was listening. That mild, childlike smile conveyed devout attention, but in reality, she was searching his words to find some revealing echo of her own passion. She was measuring him, imagining him in the moment of climax, and subtly managing to strip both him and herself under the cover of her trite phrases. I sat down in a high-backed armchair and watched. Le Pitre was evangelizing Karina, and it didn't occur to him that he was being unusually emotional. He didn't realize that his words had a new flavor and that blood was coursing through his veins. The thought, the flame he felt was a reflection from heaven, when really it was being heated by the demons of suppressed instincts well below the level of his awareness. Karina, fascinated and oblivious to her surroundings, moved her naked breast and stirring fragrance closer to Le Pitre. She leaned forward as though she would drink the words straight from his lips. I am sure Le Pitre never dreamed of kissing her and would have repudiated the thought had it occurred to him, but suddenly in the middle of his loftiest sentence, her lips crashed down on his, and there she was, embracing him. Her body clung to him like a muscular octopus, exciting his senses, and he groaned like a wounded animal before they parted abruptly. Le Pitre stared at her with horror. Then he stammered a few inarticulate words and incontinently ran. Karina merely smoothed her dress and pulled up a shoulder strap that had slipped. Then she turned to leave and saw me sitting there in the chair like a statue of misery. She didn't lose her composure. She never lost her composure. She just laughed. Did you see that? She winked like a mischievous gamine. Some prophet, right in the middle of his sermon. Shame Rosalie didn't see. I thought he was going to bite my head off. If the whole thing wasn't so funny, I'd raise a scandal. She pulled a lace handkerchief from her bosom to dry her tears of laughter. Then she noticed that I had remained silent. "Well, why don't you say something? Why do you keep looking at me like an executioner? Are you blaming me for this too?" There I was listening to his sermon, and all of a sudden he jumped at me like a wild animal. And you watched. Suddenly her voice became accusing. "You didn't defend me. Slap his face. Why, he could have raped me right in front of you for all you cared. I stood up and she drew back. "Oh yeah. Yes, you can hit me well enough. I know all about you." She turned and ran out of the room. Rosalie may have noticed the change in Le Pitre, but it may also be that the shaken man confessed his sin to her, beating his breast and begging her to help him overcome this great temptation. Pitre remained in the confidence of these two tragic people, and he told me their full story in an effort to perform psychological surgery. He wanted to free me from the monster of passion by showing me the extent and result of Karina's depravity. Poor Pitre. At any rate, Rosalie may have absolved Le Pitre verbally, but the incident started a revolt in her. Her idol had, in failing, become a living flesh and blood entity to her, and her distorted heavenly love instantly changed into a jealous, demanding physical passion. Le Pitre was hers, whether in the greatness of his purity or the covetousness of his desire. No one could take him from her. They were mated in heaven and hell. If they had soared together to heaven, they could burn together in hell. She offered him her own body to sate the dark desire that had taken hold of him. After all, this would be a much lesser sin than committing the act with another man's wife. Then later they could repent together. After all, they need only do it once. But Le Pitre was repelled by her desire and the sudden realization of how ugly, slovenly, and old she was as she bared her breasts to him in wild generosity. He had been poisoned by Karina's fragrant beauty, the flavor of her lips, and the memory of her body. Then Rosalie understood the reality and became envenomed with hatred for Le Pitre, for Karina, and for herself. She was totally deranged by the events that crashed down around her. She and Le Pitre stayed at home so that the lambs and their counter-prophets could not learn their ugly secret. They lived together like wild animals. One would hide, and the other would watch and listen suspiciously to every move. Their beds were changed from cradles of heavenly pleasure into torture racks, and the magic bridge they had built for themselves during those spiritual intercourses became a path for transmitting repulsion, suspicion, accusation, and contempt. I knew Karina would arrange to meet Le Pitre again, and she did. When Jeanne and her new husband paid us the customary visit after their marriage, she mentioned that Karina had made her a wedding present of some valuable old books from Le Pitre's shop. Karina didn't bat an eye. She simply changed the subject casually. As for me, I acted like I hadn't noticed. What could I have said? She had no capacity for compassion and understanding. She was just a blank page, a merciless astral entity in a body who had no experience of suffering. And I was living beside her like a prisoner who keeps lengthening his sentence by committing some new crime. When I was away from that enchanting body, I hated her, but I could not stay away too long, though I never lowered myself to the extent of going to her bedroom. But I despised myself when I found myself trembling with desire for the moment she would want intercourse with me again, when she would break into my room in her shameless nakedness, challenge me, infuriate me, and finally degrade me into a rutting animal with the magic of her body. she still needed me from time to time to get the sadistic gratification of having absolute power over my whole moral being. It was this desire that gave birth to her campaign against Le Pitre and Rosalie, and the demonic forces beyond her body incited the urge constantly. The unfortunate Le Pitre and Rosalie were ripe for some astral hell. Their pious self-deception had done that for them. The whole affair was blowing up for an explosion, and I felt sorry for them, yet when I could pull myself out of my own obsession in the matter, I could see that Karina was only a tool to destroy something erroneous and blind in them so they could become their true selves. When I thought of this, I began to realize dimly that my own current anguish had meaning and resolution somewhere. This was just something I had to go through, like a novice has to stumble blindfold through dark corridors at the time of his initiation. But it was only occasionally that I was able to feel like this. My days and nights and weeks and months were like a spider's web of grey despair in which I struggled fitfully. The very air felt filthy around me, and there was a muddy film in my lungs. I always felt sticky with sweat and grime, and baths in our green marble bathroom that was a vestibule for fornication never seemed to get me clean. I began to have difficulty in breathing, and my strength began to dwindle as the tuberculosis took hold of me again. I developed a racking cough and began having fevers at night. Then in the spring of 1736, I began to spit blood, and poor old Pitre used superhuman perseverance to get me to leave and take a cure. This time, I went to the snow-capped mountains of Switzerland, where the dawn glitters on the ice-laden trees. The fiery sun merely preceded the grim, snowy twilight, and the whole scene reminded me intensely of Dreiseselberg Castle and the strange colors and mists I had witnessed in the tower chambers. Even the stars looked the same from the window of the small hunting lodge where I was staying. I had been in a similar condition then too, with physical and astral diseases that never left me. I hadn't said goodbye to Karina. She hadn't been home for 2 days. That made the whole thing easier. My flaming indignation could only flare in her presence, else it drained me physically. I left a few lines for her. That was our farewell. Really, my trip was just an escape from her. I wanted to shed the worn body of Louis de la Tourzel, hoping my bondage would be shed with it. And I wanted to die alone. The giant alchemical furnace of the mountain sun couldn't heal me, for one important ingredient was missing: my will to live. I wearily loosened all the forces of decay within me and lay quietly in the crucible of the nights, dissolving in sweat and blood. But I still wasn't free of Karina. My astral rabble fed me Borgia memories like fanatical terrorists. They conjured up the odor of her sweet perfume and her words and gestures during intercourse, and painted her naked body on the canvas of my closed eyelids. Now they were celebrating their full power over my tubercular passions, dancing about my desires like night insects. In spite of all this, I sent Pitre optimistic letters and asked that he tell me everything that was happening to Karina. She herself wouldn't bother to write. Sometimes, if a messenger was available, she would send a whimsical note, sweet or sarcastic, according to her mood. Pitre wrote that Germain was manager of the household, bossing the servants and arranging receptions for playing high-stake card games, Karina's growing passion. Nor were these evenings confined to persons of our own social scale. Anyone Germain found interesting was invited. Thus, every night, aristocratic idlers, card sharps, actors, demi-mondaines, and perverts rubbed elbows in the green salon next to Karina's bedroom. Here, she had set up a fully equipped game room. The result, naturally, was a series of fights, scandals, thefts and swindles of such magnitude that they caused Corinna's high-ranking police official lovers considerable difficulty in hushing them up. There was also a nightly buffet where virtually anyone could drop in for a good meal at my expense. Of course, Pelok told me the whole truth intentionally. He hoped thus to cure me of Karina. Yet, hate is merely the other side of love. Only if I had become indifferent toward her could I have freed myself. If I could have managed not to care in how much filth she indulged herself. 3 months after I left, Rosalie murdered Le Pitre and committed suicide. Her method of murder was as insane as the passion that raged in her old body. She hacked her idol to pieces. He must have been dead after the first few blows, but the obsessed woman wanted to pay him for all her misery. She would fulfill herself just once after all these years of suppressed desires, psychic masturbations, and the floods of tears after his humiliating fall. So she bathed in his blood, since he had not let her embrace him, because she had loved him so much and been so bitterly disappointed. Then she opened her own major arteries and lay down beside the corpse, convulsively giving him the only embrace she would ever enjoy. Pelok wrote me the whole story. It was he who had found the horrifying bodies. The day of the funeral, Karina gave a gala house concert for René Gillet, a newly famous harpist. She had also taken up with the charlatan Martin Allais and appointed him her physician. When I read the letter, I simply stopped trying to make the effort to get up. What was the use? I was coughing up chunks of lung and losing weight steadily. The diseased passion within me was destroying the remnants of my strength. I wrote one more letter to Pelok and thanked him for his friendship, the only thing that had been precious in my miserable life. But my last breath held Karina's name. I had lived only 36 years in the passionate, overly sentimental body of Louis de la Tourzel.